know what geographic area you are, where you work. Not necessarily where you're based, where you're sitting today, but where you do your work, and enter that in. We can collect responses here and kind of get a sense of who all we have with us today. I'll just give this a minute to populate. Great. I see Washington, Oregon, Black Hills, South Dakota, Island Park, Idaho, Calf Canyon, Holman, New Mexico. Some people nationally, some people Rocky Mountains, Arizona. I see a few Arizonans in here. Great. Ponderosa Pine Forest. Love it. Wonderful. Well, as you guys can see, we have a lot of diversity here. I see we've got some farmers and ranchers talking about, working on those private lands. We've got people working federal land focused. Wonderful. And we can go ahead and probably move to the next one, Maria. So also just a little reflection on who you represent. We've got consultants, NGO, county employee, federal or state. Just kind of see how what that breakdown looks like. Very cool. Looks like we've got a pretty even split on the NGO versus government employees there, which is great to have that cross dialogue. Love it. And that can continue to populate, and we can share that out in the slides after the talk. Now just a moment to reflect, waking up, sitting down with your coffee today, what are you hoping to get from this webinar? What are some of those main takeaways that you are looking for? Yeah, that peer-to-peer learning, that's a huge part of building our understanding here. Mitigation successes and opportunities, yes. Actionable practices, all about that on the ground applied work. That's definitely something that Carol, our speaker today, cares a lot about and is very focused on. That's great. Tools to effectively transition from assessment to implementation. Back to that. How do we actually get traction on the ground? Love it. Post-fire flooding lessons learned. Yes. Community engagement. All right. Well, it sounds like this aligns super well with what I expect to be coming out of this talk today, and glad to see we're on the same page with folks who are attending. All right. Without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing to you all today a uniquely qualified expert who is also the founder of my organization, Carol Ekarius. She was the founder and executive director for over a decade of Coalition for the Upper South Platte River, which a lot of folks have probably heard of CUSP, and a longtime member of the state of Colorado's Forest Health Advisory Council. She also founded and was the CEO of Coalitions and Collaboratives, or COCO, where I work today. And COCO is an organization created to help grow place-based collaborative conservation organizations. Over Carol's tenure at CUSP and COCO, she worked extensively on forest and watershed health, wildfire mitigation and recovery, and building climate resilience. Carol has worked directly on over a dozen large wildfires and advised community members throughout the country on many more wildfires, a whole diversity of context around those. So she has a wealth of knowledge. She brings decades of experience in government and nonprofit management. She's also a freelance writer and author of 9 books covering topics in sustainable small-scale agriculture and farming and environmental solutions. So with that, take it away, Carol.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Maria, next slide. And since that's just a cover slide, we can go on to the next slide. And we're going to go through this fairly quickly. There's a lot of information. This could probably be a 3-hour webinar. And so I'm going to pop through slides fast. If you have specific questions, please put them in the Zoom chat, and I will try to respond if I can to them. If we had a longer time, I'd make it a more open and interactive discussion that way. We will have some Menti slides, a couple in here. This is, again, a little bit more about me, but Maria, you can go to the next slide. And this is one of the questions. We didn't have anybody answer as being a farmer or rancher, but we know some of you wear multiple hats. So if you do farm or ranch, are you an irrigator? Anybody out there on this call irrigating? Because irrigators, or working with irrigators, I would say, if you work with irrigators, then go ahead and say yes, because you have some unique challenges that I will mention as we go forward in the discussion. Okay, we do have a few irrigators, so I'll touch on that. Maria, we can go ahead and go on. Okay, so if most of you know a lot of this stuff, so again, I am going to go quickly through these slides, but if you have never been there, NMCEWL is a really important tool. You know, these are the 2022 fires just in New Mexico. I zoomed in because we're partnering with Covera, but it shows fires from all across the country. During fires, it's a great place to get information. It is updated frequently when there's big fires. You can click on these little links and go directly to fire information. The link with the tree on it is for the Bear Reef report, and the link with the flame, you see those little flame icons, that's active fire information. You should go on to the next slide, Maria. I just want to pop through these picture slides quickly, and we don't have to take long, just kind of run them until we get to the slide with the video. But this is the aftermath of fires and flooding, and plenty of you have seen this already. But I think that's where we spend a lot of time and where we're focusing today on the recovery. This is a video of one of my favorite post-fire flood videos, not that I'm happy for the folks impacted, but this is a flood in Cachita Canyon from the Dixie Fire in New Mexico. The video is not great quality-wise, but you can kind of see the massive amount of water coming down this area. This flood was in a stream channel that at bank full, so kind of the regular full amount of water, is in the springtime, I was told it would be about a 50 cubic foot per second bank full stream. It was estimated that at the peak of this, in this later part of the video, 5 minutes later, that this exceeded 20,000 CFS. Now, most fire floods aren't quite that extreme, but believe me when I say every fire scar has extreme flooding that comes out of its drainages that, you know, people cannot appreciate if they have not seen that somewhere before. Maria, go on to the next slide, please. Okay, we're going to talk just a little bit about the before the fire pieces, because there are things that we can do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to just touch on it. Next slide. This is a FEMA slide, and it's 12 ways to prepare, and I think it's pretty important for all of us. If you go to FEMA.gov, you will find this poster on their website. If you're a person who works with community members, you're a federal, state, county, or nonprofit employee, a tribal member who is out working with folks in your community, this little poster is a great poster to have a discussion with folks around. And it's important for post-fire as well. Then one of the things I think that I tell people early on is to think about hardening homes or structures or infrastructure first and foremost, even before we start talking about mitigating forest lands themselves. It's getting things hardened around them. And this again comes from wildfirerisk.org. I pulled this up for risk to homes in New Mexico. So this is off of wildfirerisk.org's website. You can go for any state and look at these maps that give you a real idea of where the highest risks are. But make no mistake, even if you go into these light yellow areas on this map that are not the highest areas in the state, it doesn't mean there's no risk in those areas. So if you're working with community members, being able to get these tools. Then for whatever state you're in, State Forest Service tends to be a great resource on the pre-forest mitigation side of things. There's also watershed groups, forest collaboratives that do this work. In a lot of places, local county governments or local tribes do the work. But in every state, your State Forest Service offices are going to be able to help get information out on, what should we be doing to mitigate? We can mitigate all we want, though, and we're never going to stop the fire. So on to the next slide, where we're going to spend, this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time today. It's on this, what happens after the fire. The first thing that happens is a whole lot of the resources leave. So when the fire is burning with a big fire, there can be many thousands of people, federal agency staff from various agencies, various state agency staff come in. They're there, they're helping the community, the leaders, the emergency managers, the firefighters in the community, the elected officials. Then the fire's contained and they pretty much all disappear. And the community and the folks who live in that area, they're left to deal with the extreme flood risk, the debris flows, and the safety concerns that come with those. And these are really long-term effects. You can have significant flooding years or even decades after a post-fire. Those scars behave hydrologically and hydraulically different. One of the first things we try to do in a fire scar is look at the downstream areas and really figure out where are the homes, the businesses, the values at risk. We try to work with residents or elected officials to say, really think about landing zones for areas that can't be evacuated. If you have a community that has one way in and one way out, and it's going to be lost in the flooding, then you're going to have to think, how do you get people out? There's a question on where is that town? It is Manitou Springs in Colorado after the Waldo fire. And then in a lot of these areas, we will quickly try and set up some tabletop exercises for the residents that are most affected for flooding. So we'll actually bring fairly small groups in and have them think through scenarios. And it's even scenarios like if you're stuck there because that road's washed out and you have really big dogs, do you have some dog food prepped? I mean, some of it seems silly, but it can make a real difference in your life. If you have somebody there who can't get out, but who needs to get to the doctor regularly, what are you going to do? And sandbagging really quickly where applicable is an important thing that, we can get that going really fast. We don't need the government money to come in immediately to get sandbagging going. for government people thinking about closing these roads quickly and efficiently, I will tell you that's, again, Waldo Canyon on the lower left with all those flooded cars. And, you know, CDOT, our state Department of Transportation, after this flood, really began shutting down the highway very quickly. When this fire happened, they weren't. They were kind of like, oh, well, we don't want to interrupt traffic. This particular road carries 60,000 cars a day. So they were like, oh, well, we don't want to interrupt it. After that, they closed frequently. Culverts and bridges are often going to fail. There's an item sticking up in the air in this picture that I don't know if you can see it, but it is a culvert. That washed down miles. And so for public works crews and counties and local governments, really thinking about these culvert placements, can you harden them? Can they be cleaned? Where you had a 24-inch before, you may suddenly need a 20-foot box culvert. And that's hard for people to contemplate. One of the things in rural areas, low water crossings are often the best option. So those hardened, up here we call them Texas crossings. They work together, or they work well to get people in and out in more remote areas where people can understand not to cross it when the flood is happening. Pull together the stakeholders, and that should be really everybody in your community to be part of a recovery team. You want the federal land managers, their folks, you want local government people. If these groups are kind of formed ahead of time, and I'll tell you where we have forest collaboratives or watershed groups working ahead of time, then when this fire happens, or frankly, any other natural disaster happens, people can get working quickly. They know who to call. They know who will know to call someone else if they don't already know who to call, because they have that network. We're going to get information fairly quickly from the Forest Service or BLM, depending on which Fed land manager has the bulk of the lands. If there's no Fed involvement, then it's up to states to come up with things like burn severity, post-fire hydrology, and debris flow analysis. The debris flow can be done by USGS, and we're going to go into that in a few minutes in more detail. And they can respond to requests for that. So reports you're going to need to get, the Forest Service Burned Area Emergency Response Report. NRCS comes out and does the Emergency Watershed Protection Analysis. Army Corps teams are usually available to come help with analysis. Your state Homeland Security, public health departments, and again, your local groups. One thing I want to say about BEAR, BEAR is a really important thing that goes on after a fire, but honestly, their mandate is to look at responding to protect their values at risk on their land. So a lot of people think, oh, the BEAR team is coming in and they're going to take care of this. They're not really going to take care of the flooding that comes off of their lands that can impact you downstream. They will help you understand it, but they're not going to be able to mitigate it for the most part. So thinking you're going to count on them to do that is a bad thought process. NRCS is the one that works with the local landowners and private property owners after a fire through their EWP program. Again, they can do a lot of things on this. They can protect a lot of values. On transportation, I will say there's a couple things they don't do. They don't rebuild culverts and bridges typically. That has to come from other money. It may come from FEMA public assistance, but they can help you identify those values that need to be protected and think through ways to mitigate the flooding. On a big fire, a hot fire, they're not going to stop it either. And these programs can be somewhat slow to actually get work out on the ground. So it can be frustrating for landowners. Okay, USGS does the debris flow program. Even if your is not got any federal land nexus, the state emergency managers can reach out to the USGS folks at the landslide division that URL is on this slide. And when you reach out to them, they will prep these for fires, for big fires, even if there's not a federal land nexus. Where there is a federal land nexus, the feds usually get them to do it fairly quickly once it's apparent that this is a major fire. Next one, this one shows, and this is the Hermit's Peak fire. You know, this is showing what a volume looks like. And we're going to break now. Maria, then is the next slide, the break for going to this. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, you guys have to allow me to share.
You should be good, Carol. Did you see the little box pop up?
Ah, there we are. Okay. Thank you. So this is what you get to when you first go to that landslides.gov site for debris flows. And I'm going to look at Hermit's Peak on this one, but you could apply this to any fire anywhere around. Okay, come on, Hermit's Peak. There we go. If you haven't seen this tool before, this is really important information. What is a debris flow? It's all the trees and big rocks that come out. It's the houses, it's the propane tanks, it's the stock trailers, the camp trailers, all the things that can get picked up and moved with a fire. And so if we zoom into this preliminary hazard assessment, there's several different layers. Oops, I zoomed a little too much there. There's several different layers. This is the basin probability layer. And any of these red basins on here, there's a 60 to 80% probability that in a 15-minute high intensity rain event, there is going to be a debris flow in that basin. The yellow ones is 0 to 20%. So if you're in a yellow area, there may or may not be a debris flow, but it's not really highly likely. If you get into these brown, red, and brownish red colors, then you can see one of these really dark areas over, I don't know if you see my mouse or not, but like over in this area, you'll see these really dark colors. There's an 80 to 100% chance in that area that there's going to be a debris flow. So if you're looking at this and you have values at risk and you're trying to say, wow, Montezuma is right down here, this is a value at risk. We have private property, we have homes, we have businesses, we have things we care about, and we have these high debris flow areas. Those might be the first areas you're going to look at to do some mitigation work. And then I want to get up here and I want to go to the basin volume. These are things that I look at right after a fire. The basin volumes tell me how much is going to come out of a given basin. And I want to get down to, I zoomed out too far. Let's see if I can. I'm going in and bigger, right? Damn it. Well, I don't know how I got zoomed like this. Okay, here we go. The basin volumes tell us how much is going to come out of these areas. And if you look at these red areas, it could be 60 to 100,000 tons of debris that comes out of an area like that. So when you see that volume, think of it like a cubic yard of material is sort of like a washing machine. That's about the size. So when they're saying 100,000 cubic yards of material can come out of these areas, that's what you're talking about coming down the hill. So studying this map, understanding what drainages are going to be the worst problems from debris flow is going to help you to understand where you need to do post-fire work first. Okay, Maria, can we go back to the slideshow? I'm going to stop sharing.
So Carol, if you hover over me on the dots, go ahead and just make me the host.
Oh, there you go. Why don't we make you and me co-hosts? You'll have to do that.
Okay,
But
I'll do
you're
that.
now in charge again.
Gotcha.
So we have an open discussion question up right now. And so questions, comments, things you're having thoughts about related to what you've seen so far. Somebody down in our chat has said it is important to have qualified geologists and watershed specialists validate data and maps from USGS, and that's true. And so there's this kind of dance with this data. A lot of it comes out pretty quickly. It is developed off of satellite imagery. Then we go back out on the ground with field staff who will validate it. But I've yet to see say a USGS map that says high probability of a large debris flow that's totally wrong. They might reduce that a little bit. They might take it down from an 80 to 100 to a 60 to a 80%, but they don't it doesn't go away usually. So just think of that as you're looking at the data, especially in the first weeks after the fire. It will be refined over time. And yeah, flooding is already a regular occurrence in a lot of these places, but post-fire, it does expand exponentially. So of what you would have as a 2-year rain event that before a fire would have put a 2-year amount of drainage could put a 10-year amount of drainage. A 10-year rain event that before a fire would have equated to a 10-year runoff event can suddenly equate to a 100-year flood event. So we see that, and we're going to go into that a little bit more. And one of the problems we have is that it takes a lot of time for a lot of the agencies and money to come together. So that can be challenging. California has the work program. Oregon also has a program run by the Army Corps, I believe. Colorado has programs run by the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So state agencies often do pop in to assist in this analysis and getting more data and getting data for off of the federal lands or on fires that don't have a federal nexus. During suppression, a lot of times the feds show up at the request of a state, even if there's not a federal land nexus, to help manage a big fire. But you're not going to get the bear reports and things like that produced by the land management agencies for you. Okay, let's go ahead and go on to the next, Maria. Next thing, I want to talk about US Stream Stats. And this is a tool that you can use before fires to think of pre-fire planning, but it's a tool we regularly use after fires very quickly to get our arms around what would happen in a given place. And Maria, I'm going to share again, and I see you already made me co-host. So aren't we getting our act together? Stream Stats produces reports like this that allow us to make some prognoses about what flooding we're going to see coming out of fire scars. My rule of thumb, so peak flows coming off of a fire scar can be anywhere from 10 to 60 times what you see on a stream stats report. So if the 50% flood is what would have come out of a 2-year rain event out of this drainage prior, 612 cubic feet per second would have come out of this is stream stats estimate. That means on a 10-year or a 2-year event, you could have 6,000 to 36,000 coming out. On a 10-year, that's the 10% flood in the report. You know, you could have 21,000 to 129,000 coming out of a drainage. These are, again, incomprehensible numbers. That's what happened in the Cochita Canyon scenario. So just thinking these can be beyond imagination if you have yet to see a post-fire flood. And then we're going to go over here. So stream stats, I've already gone to the page and gotten linked in to the area around Montezuma Township, the Montezuma community at the edge of the Hermit's Peak fire as my example. The tool takes a little bit of time to get to figure out, but it's not rocket science. Anybody can take a little bit of time and learn to use this tool. So we're going to say that we're going to use the New Mexico data, and we need to zoom in and zoom in some more. And when you get these lines showing up, these drainage lines, then you can do a delineation. So I want to delineate an area. I'm going to come over here and put a clicked point on that area. And right now you can see a link over here on the side, the toolbar that says delineate. And the machine is working on delineating the watershed that drains to that point. This takes a minute or so. And it has delineated a watershed for me. So we can look at, this is all the area that drains into Montezuma. And we know from the fire, from the debris flow data and from fire maps that there's some pretty hot burns in this area. So the sub watersheds in here have burned hot and could produce really high runoff. So I'm going to go continue on this, and it's going to ask me to select some information, and I'll build a report. And I'm picking peak flow and bank full statistics. And I'm going to create the report. You can do this on any basin. If I owned a ranch, a smaller ranch up in here, I would delineate at the point of my ranch. If I live further down, I might delineate further down. And the final thing is, I'm going to say open the report. And here is a report created by StreamStats. And again, if I look at those numbers, I'm going to see the numbers that tell me what flood values were estimated by this program prior to the fire. And I'm going to say, hey, this could be anywhere from 10 to 60 times worse than what we're seeing here, which again becomes really mind-boggling. If you have not seen it, if you've never been at the edge of one of these fires, you will probably not believe it, but it does happen. So that tool is really useful. We use it very quickly around fire scars. And a lot of times then, you know, various Fed agencies or state agencies will jump in and do a more detailed analysis. And those detailed analyses are better. But again, you would be surprised at how often their top numbers come in line with what we get by using StreamStats and the 10 and 60 multipliers. It's just uncanny for what I can do in 5 minutes rather than waiting for, 3 weeks for a more in-depth analysis. Okay. Going to stop sharing that tool again, and I'm just going to look and see, do we have questions or comments? Doesn't look like it. Maria, we can go back to our slideshow and look at what we have left. And we have another open discussion. So questions, comments, observations on what I've gone through with stream stats and how it's used and what you've seen in a post-fire flood in your community. Have you seen this? Have you gone like, holy cow, I cannot believe what came out of that little drainage? We've walked by people's houses and said, you know, your house is going to flood. And they'll say, I've lived here on this little drainage for 60 years and there's never flood here. And it's like, well, guess what? You didn't live here when there was a fire scar. You lived here before a fire scar. So, you know, wrapping your mind around that. And sure enough, you know, a week later, one of the people I can think of was a retired fire chief in this little town. And he's like, I've been here my whole life. You're crazy. And a week later, a flood hit his house and he called and said, obviously, I'm eating crow now. And yeah, it's difficult. I agree. Implementing the mitigations, first, you have to have some thought about where to implement. Then you got to figure out how to pay for it. That's often a problem. If you're waiting for Fed money and state money to come in, well, that gets to be challenging, right? You got to wait for the agencies to get the money to you. One of the things we've learned is even if money is theoretically approved, then all of a sudden you find out, you know, Office of Management and Budget is holding up getting the money actually out to NRCS to implement the EWP projects in your community. And when you have the monsoons going on, you're going to have crews working up in drainages where it can flood. So really, you know, we've had to have crews move their machine uphill literally with 20 minutes before they would have lost an excavator had it still been down in the drainage. So for that, we keep really close communications with our NOAA friends, our National Weather Service folks. They do issue the flood warnings, but you can also, if you know you're working in the fire scar, you have people in the scar, you can get a direct line and they will actually put you on an immediate notification list that goes out, like get out now kind of notice. But even folks getting with your community members to have them be aware, getting weather service radios. Those weather radios will wake people up in the middle of the night. California, the Thompson flood, that came in the middle of the night. People were in bed. So if you have one of those weather radios in your bedroom, believe me, it will wake you up. So those are important tools to get. Yeah, ½ inch of rain, closed roads, going through houses, places you've never seen it in the Hermit's Peak fire. And that's the problem. You know, it's like, this is a dry gulch. It never runs, you know, and yet a ½ inch rain in 15 minutes and suddenly you do have a flood. And that's why I say this is incomprehensible till you've lived with it and seen it. All right, Maria, let's move on. So I want to talk a little bit about treatments. And after the fire, or afterwildfire.org in New Mexico is a state website that actually has some really good information on these treatments. Our After the Flames website, and I believe we'll have a link to that at the end, also has a lot of information on treatments. How can these get arranged and how quickly then can they get done and what are the pros and cons? We're not going to go into great detail on any of them, but we'll kind of go through quickly. Leave that previous one on, please, Maria. So with hill slope treatments, that's things like seeding, log erosion barriers, wattles. They can actually get done pretty quickly, and private landowners can get in and do them. And Maria, I'm still seeing the secure funding page. There we go. Thank you. Erosion matting in places. And those treatments can get done reasonably quick, but they're not necessarily reasonably cheap. Probably log erosion barriers and wattles are about the cheapest of those to do, and even private landowners can implement them. But one thing about those two treatments, if they're done properly, they're really effective. If they're not done properly, if somebody doesn't get them installed correctly, they don't get the log erosion barrier perpendicular to the slope, perpendicular to the flow line, and they don't get it bedded well and secured into the slope well, then a log erosion barrier can actually make more trouble than if you didn't do anything on a slope. So it's critical for these types of treatments that people know how to do it. As for seeding, I remember after the Hayman fire, we had pretty much wholesale seeding on the Hall fire. Over the years, we've come to the decision that seeding is more valuable when it is strategically placed in places. We do use seed around our log erosion barriers to help secure them when we put them in, or around the wattles, or in selective areas that we will do seeding. But the Fed agencies don't do a lot of it anymore because it's really expensive. It can introduce invasive species, which then becomes their own problem. And so think of it as a selective tool in your hill slope treatments. Channel treatments, check dams, J-hooks, bank armoring, bank full benches, those take actually, you know, concerted designs by hydrologists, afterthewildfire.org. I do believe that is the correct one, but someone is saying they're having trouble reaching out to it. So Eric Hayes from FEMA is going to Google it. And Eric, if I typed that in wrong, would you please type the correct one? But it is the New Mexico State Forest Service post-wildfire webpage. Channel treatments, these require folks who actually know what they're doing to design them. So engineers, hydrologists, folks like that. Oh, afterthewildfire, NewMexico.org. Thank you. We'll add that on the slides before we're done.
They would. Yeah. That's new. This sedge that's growing here in between the ditches, it used to be in the bed itself, and that's why I put the wire on there so they wouldn't dig it up. But now there's sedge out here, so hopefully they'll be.
Peter,
yeah.
Are you talking to us on our, or are you on a phone call? Thank you, Peter. I got a little confused there. So these channel treatments and debris basins are specialized, generally off-channel ponds that are designed to collect flood, flow, and debris, and then release the waters back into the stream system. They're going to have an engineer or a hydrologist or somebody with knowledge, and they are much more expensive. We've done really large debris basins and we've done small ones, but there's a bigger cost and bigger planning that takes place to put them in. Roads and culverts, armoring the abutments and the inlets and outlets, that can be done relatively quickly, relatively cheaply. Nowadays, at this point in time, I will tell you, with the Colorado Department of Transportation engineers, when we talk about which culverts and bridges they will have problems with, they believe us, and they will go out and start doing armoring right away because that's relatively inexpensive. Improving culverts by upsizing them, that becomes more expensive. Putting in low water crossings, that becomes more expensive. Water bars become more expensive, but they're really good tools. And those are tools that local government, public works departments can usually implement. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about funding. We only have 7 minutes left. So there's lots of different funding that becomes available, but how to tap into it, who has what, where it can be spent, that proves challenging for folks. Again, EWP, Emergency Watershed Protection Program, that's from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. That can be spent on private lands. I've often seen it take 6 months to a year, though, to actually be able to begin implementing the projects under that program. So they're not going to be much help in the first year or so of the first monsoon season. It just is a little slower program. We do have a question on, is anyone using livestock on top of seeding to rehab? And I do know some ranchers who have done that, Ellen, and it's actually been really good. I also know in Australia, one of the funny things, oh, we can go till 10. I was thinking Maria had said we had to be done at 9:30. Okay, good. I can slow down a bit. Ellen, in Australia, they're also using dogs with packs that will have holes drilled in them, and the dogs run around in the fire scar. And as they go, these dog packs are flapping and spitting seed out on the ground randomly. But where we see ranchers go in and seed and then put livestock in, the hoof action actually does help to get the seed bedded, to create little tiny water pans around the seed that help. So that is definitely a doable thing where you have some livestock that can do that sort of rehab. Maria, I'm not sure if we have on the After the Flames website any information on that. We can look for it and add it to the website, or I would Google livestock post-fire rehab and see what you can come up with. But I have seen it done. I know a couple of ranchers that did a really great job. Yeah, check the Holistic Resource Management Office. If you're in New Mexico, they're very active there, and they have a lot of information on this. Do we have other questions or comments, since given a bit more? Oh, somebody says they've also seen the dog packs used in Chile. And TNC also uses mineral blocks to pull bison into graze specific areas down for invasive species control. And I'm assuming that's after a plains fire. So one of the things to think about is fire. We think a large part about it with mountains and trees, but it is not exclusively a mountain and trees issue. It can be a plains issue. Last winter at just about this time, I think it was New Year's Eve, we had a plains fire in Colorado that burned, 1,000+ homes. And so, these fast moving grass fires can be extremely challenging. So the HPCC Fire Assistance Act draft regs being formulated now by FEMA include compensation for post-fire flooding mitigation and reforestation. So that's going to help as well. One thing I will say about FEMA and post-fire flooding that I've advocated for a long time, and it hasn't happened yet, but I have faith someday it will come to pass, is that the post-fire floods become attached for at least a certain number of years to the original fire declaration. So I think most people on this call understand that, there's a disaster declaration for these large wildfires, but then afterward, the post-fire flooding, each flood has to rank up to the level of a disaster in its own right to get disaster compensation through FEMA. And that becomes really challenging. So a lot of the post-fire flooding impacts totally become the problem for the state and local governments, because each flood does not become something that rates to that layer of being a disaster. And yet when you have 5 or 10 of these floods in 2 or 3 years after a fire, it's terribly challenging. And then a question on, can I talk a little bit about long-term funding strategies? HPCC is front and center right now, but next fire season, or when flares up, how do we get there? How do we keep funding long-term? And is there funding for fence post fires for non-agricultural lands? That one, I would say usually not. Ag land producers can get money for rebuilding fences from the EQIP program, but generally non-ag producers have a hard time coming up with that kind of funding. You may be able to classify as a forest ag person, and if you jump the hoops to do that, you can probably get equip money through being forest ag, but it's much more challenging. And Stacy's asking questions on is that someone impacted by a HPCC fire or other? I'm not sure. And we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So we'll try and cover some more of these at the end if we have time. We do have a few people anyway that are bouncing at 9:30. If you are bouncing and you can't stay on, what I will let you know is the video will be up and the PowerPoint with it. Maria, that's at the After the Flames website, and will Quivera also have it on their website? I'm not hearing a response. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry. After the flames, what goes after the flames, we'll definitely have it information on the website after this.
Okay, and Sarah at Quivera was about to speak. Are you going to put it on your
Yeah,
website?
I think we can put some information on our website as well as the New Mexico CEWL and Colorado CEWL website. So we have 3 different places where we'll try to share some information.
Great. So if you have to hop, you can come back on through those websites, look at the rest of the program, look at the video, or if you want to share the video later with other folks in your community, please feel free to get the information out. Now, I want to talk more about funding, and then we'll have some more open discussion about it. BEAR funding is the funding from the federal land management agencies to the federal land management agencies for protecting their own resources. So that's their value at risk, like campgrounds, trails, roads within the forest, things of that nature. And so thinking in terms of, you know, what they're going to do may help you somewhat downstream, but it's probably not going to help the flooding a whole lot, unfortunately. There has been talk at the Washington level between FEMA, BEAR, and NRCS about how in the future we may be able to fund work on public lands in order to mitigate flooding off the public lands. There's discussions about that. I'm hopeful that at some point in time, we will figure out a good mechanism to do that. But right now, there's really limited opportunities for that. I think a few of the opportunities that we have seen where it has worked is when there's, say, a municipal reservoir or water diversion system that's on the forest, but that is owned and operated by a municipality. Then we've been able to use emergency watershed money to implement treatments on federal land to protect that value at risk. And one of our Forest Service employees also said they're aware of NRCS doing some treatments on federal lands in order to protect downstream values at risk. So there's a little bit of that, but it does become pretty challenging, and figuring out how the value at risk is being protected and defining that it's not easy. So, and it's definitely not quick. Sometimes though, one of the good things that we see come out of those partnerships and that identifying values at risk and having all these partners on our recovery committee working together to make this work out, is that they will figure out ways to funnel money to a partner who could spend it more easily on federal land than necessarily the Fed agencies can quickly. So there's times when, for example, a water provider will spend money and get the work done, and then EWP or FEMA will come in and help pay for what they did. But that takes those recovery committees working together. I think after the Cameron Peak fire in Colorado, in northern Colorado, you know, they did some of that where, you know, the water providers up in northern Colorado, Northern Conservancy District, City of Fort Collins, Greeley, they put money in, helped get work done, then got reimbursed on it. So there are ways to crack the nut, but if you don't have a recovery team working together, you'll never figure them out. State money. So in Colorado, that's where I'm giving my personal examples from. We have the Colorado Water Conservation Board, our Department of Public Health and Environment through their 319 program, and the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management through FEMA money, that they come together and they've put money into doing post-fire recovery work, and sometimes long-term money. And a lot of times they've been able to fund the watershed groups and other coalitions to do this work through grant money. So I think there's ways, again, when you have a recovery committee, people are working together to get them pulled into these longer term funding strategies together. Private foundations, local businesses, and volunteer and in-kind. There are a handful of private foundations that do disaster recovery work nationally, and there's a disaster funders website. So if you Google disaster funders, you'll come up with a website and you can see some of the foundations. You have to do your homework and do research. Are they a foundation that funds in your region? That kind of thing. So they can be more effective, though, if they are truly a local foundation. So the community foundations, the local community, the Pikes Peak Community Foundation, for example, helping after the Waldo fire. Some of them are large community foundations, well endowed and can bring a lot of money to the table. Some are fairly small. They might bring a couple $1,000s in a small rural community, but it's something to help get work done. It might be the money to help get some of the planning done that you're going to need to then go to federal and state agencies for bigger grants. Local businesses, we've had good luck a few times with businesses like FedEx and UPS, who depend on getting through those highways to fund us through. They do have disaster programs and to help fund work because we're looking at keeping the highways open. Finally, volunteers and in-kind, you have to figure out a way to track every bit of volunteer and in-kind donations. Volunteer hours are relatively easy to set up a tracking system. In-kind is the values that are given to you. If you do log erosion barriers, every tree has a value that you cut down and put into the hill slope. If somebody gives you rock to harden around an abutment, somebody donates rock off their property, you can document the value of that rock. And the more you do that, the better off you are. But these are long-term costs and they're going to stick with you. Okay, we have some more questions over and comments over here. Maria, do we have a next slide for an open discussion? Nope, we have water issues. So let me just go.
We will have a Q&A at the very end. So then that way everything is recorded with all the questions at the end. So Lynn and I will be working in getting those questions into Menti.
Oh, okay. You guys are going to try and get them entered ahead of time?
Yeah. So you might see some repeated questions at the very end. We should have saw the many funding questions that would come in. But if we could please maybe save the rest of those so that you can finish presenting and then we can.
Yeah, we only have a few more slides, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk a little bit about water issues. These are long-term issues. And that is a fish kill from one of the fires in southern Colorado. Right now, I forget which fire. There have been so many. But you see how the fish's gills are completely ashed in. And so this was an area that was affected by the Animas mine drainage a few years earlier. And really, the mine drainage made national news, but it didn't kill any fish. Then we have a fire in that same area and it killed, I believe there was like 20,000, estimated 20,000 fish died in the reach below the fire scar. So these impacts last a long time. There's a great study out of Canada that water quality issues for water providers they've had impacts in a reservoir 200 miles out on the plains and downstream of a fire up in their mountain watershed. So that can be hazardous algal blooms, higher nutrients, things like that. So, we see these impacts, they last a long time. It takes quite a number of years before you see those cleaned up. Especially at very first ash runs, that water can be toxic to wildlife and fish. So if you have a pond like this and it gets overwhelmed in a flood of the initial ash run post-fire, fence your livestock out of it. And I know that is a terribly challenging thing a lot of times for livestock producers. Keep your dogs out of it at first, but because those initial ash runs carry a lot of high metals like mercury and lead that have bioaccumulated over decades or centuries, arsenic, things like that, and that get released from the ash and carried down immediately in those early floods, that water is really bad. Also, because of that, especially in the early floods, but even longer term when there's flood warnings, I urge all diverters, if you possibly can, close your head gates. And later folks will tell me, oh, well, I wanted to get that water into my system, and then their system is highly damaged because of the flood. I worked with the Silt Conservancy District a couple of years ago after the Grizzly Creek fire. They ran that flood water through their system, the channel that takes their water to the pump house, and the pumps in the pump house were significantly damaged, high cost damages to them. So sometimes it's painful as an irrigator to bite the bullet and let water pass, but there are times when it really is the best thing. Some lessons from the field. This is a marathon, guys. I wish it wasn't. Some of the most successful post-fire recoveries we've been involved with, we've seen really significant, almost back to baseline water issues within about 5 years. But fires that don't have that same amount of input, it can take decades. On the Hayman fire, we had floods that destroyed a county road 6 years later, or a state highway, 6 years later, and that almost took out the same state highway 15 years after the fire. CDOT had done, by that point in time, a lot of bank armoring, so it held, but this is a long-term issue for flooding. These landscapes are going to be different for decades or centuries. A lot of them are in wholesale transition from the type of ecosystem they were. They might have been a forest, now they're a shrub grassland. And without intensive planting that we don't seem to have enough money to do, they're not coming back to a forest anytime soon. One of the things in the early period when you are spending money on planning and assessments and all, really think about what planning options you want to use and invest strongly in one or two instead of dribbling money in 10 directions. But that money is going to help you to prioritize work that you need to do. Developing the relationships between the cooperators is hard, and don't put off the hard discussions. I go into community meetings and I just say, you are unfortunately in for hell for a while if you live in these areas. There's another tool I didn't mention, it's risk.org. They have some good flood maps. People can put their addresses in and you can see if you're in the flood zone on that map, you are in the flood zone for after a fire. Public education is a really important thing. Understanding the roles and capacities of the different partners, that's critical. Who can do what, who can bring what to the table? How can we leverage off of each other to get the most work done? Especially for this long-term funding question. If we can leverage little bits from a lot of different parties, we can keep long-term recovery going. But it takes that kind of leverage. the more we have that leverage, the more we can show these collaborative partnerships working together, the more likely we are going to get bigger amounts of money from the feds. Use volunteers, but do so with care. You have to be prepped for how do you evacuate your volunteers if the flood message comes out? How do you reach out to them? And don't necessarily rebuild the same way you built in the past. If you're redoing culverts, don't put in the same culvert you had there. Do we have any more slides, Maria? So this is my contact information. This was a short webinar. Like I said, I could have slowed this gone through many hours of discussing around these points, but we wanted to keep it a fairly quick webinar today. And this is our After the Flames website that we've created over the years that has a whole lot of links to important information from various state agencies around the country, various nonprofit agencies, and just federal and state information. Maria has added that we are planning to do some more webinars next year. And so we'll get that information out. If you signed up today, you'll be on the list. So how do we support communities when they're not seeing federal funding? One thing I say to communities, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Like it or not, get squeaky. Talk to your federal and state legislators. Talk to the agency folks. If you create a recovery committee, invite your state NRCS director to a meeting to talk about long-term recovery efforts and how to fund them. You get your state's emergency watershed protection person who runs the program for your state at your meetings. Get your Forest Service key staff at your meetings. And how do we get not so reliant on federal support? Boy, that is a tough nut to crack. Developing local funding sources, and a lot of these communities are rural communities. There's not a lot of capacity. We've talked about this at COCO, that the local watershed groups, they do not have the same ability to come up with unrestricted grant money that, say, a Nature Conservancy does, or a Trout Unlimited. And yet they are the ones that end up responsible for getting a lot of the work done on the ground. We have worked with fee-for-service models on some projects. That helps. Where we partner with them under things like stewardship agreements to bring some matching funds and keep things happening. And if we're bringing some matching funds, it helps encourage them to bring some more funds into the project. We've worked to highlight these areas to our state legislators and state agencies so that we can continue to work through their grant funding programs and have them put an emphasis on it. I think at this point in time, we see more and more state involvement and federal involvement, recognizing that this is a long-term issue. The Wildfire Leadership Council at the federal level has started talking a lot more about post-fire and how we deal with it at the Fed level. So that is, the Deputy Undersecretary for Ag, Interior, the Chief of the Forest Service, a Deputy Director in FEMA, folks like that are part of the Wildfire Leadership Council. And, about 3 or 4 years ago, they actually started talking more about post-fire. It can also be put into the cohesive strategy agreements between states and the feds. And I think that helps raise it. The Western Governors Association did include that post-fire as an issue in their cohesive strategy agreement with the federal government. So, there's movement here, but I'm not going to lie and tell anybody it's easy. CALOS has post-fire funding and can issue task orders. So that's the California Office of Emergency Management, I'm assuming. and they can do evaluations to help mitigate VARs. Have you had experience working with tribes? I have not worked directly with tribes. And they do have really unique access to funding, but we do have, the AIM program has worked with tribes now on some pre-fire mitigation money and capacity building. And we have several tribes that we funded so far. And I would urge you to go to our website. Maria, would you put the AIM program information in both a box here for folks and down in the text box for folks? But that has helped tribes. And I think we're building more relations with tribes that, you know, we can help you think through on an individual basis. If you reach out, you know, what can we do? How can we go forward? Who might you be reaching out to for funding? Using local neighbors, we've had good luck, and we've had good luck with local neighbors who are contractors in some fires, who will come in and use their own heavy equipment and help do some of this work at little or no cost. We've had contractors say, you buy my fuel and I'll do this project that's helping my neighbors, my community. And then that becomes an in-kind value. You can capture that value and use that to leverage additional funding. Tracking volunteer hours, you absolutely need to track them. We have volunteer sign-in sheets, you know, have everybody sign in. And in fact, when we get audited, some years, auditors will go through extra steps in various years, and they'll pull some of our volunteer records, and they'll send a note to a volunteer that says, we see that according to this, you volunteered for one of our groups on, you know, July 13th, working on such and such a fire for 4 hours. Is that correct? And so you do need that documentation. The independent sector website has the volunteer rates for each state, what the hourly rate you can use for general volunteers. I think right now in Colorado, it's like $28 an hour. So that does add up. And again, the other in-kind stuff, people using trees from on the site, using rock from on the site, having a local quarry that donates rock to your project, having other people, you know, having a local contractor that donates, you know, erosion control fabric to a project. Those kind of things add up. So being able to track it all, track it into your bookkeeping system. So have a way to actually have documentation of it and get it tracked into your bookkeeping system so you can indeed use it as match against your grants. Are there examples? I've seen communities that actually the disaster recovery funding has helped make them a stronger community in the long run. They build this local coalition out of it. The local coalition can then go on and do more work. I've seen communities that have done where their groups have gotten together, and afterward they actually help build arts programs and around things, environmental education in schools. So at times you will see the silver lining of a fire is that it does bring longer term cohesiveness, which adds to the economy. It can also bring relationships that get more pre-fire mitigation done in areas that have not yet burned. And so you'll see community members helping to support those kind of projects, which helps support money into the local economy. You'll see protection for recreation values coming out, and those rec dollars become important for the community. And again, for the capacity for future fire and flood response, in 2013, when Colorado had the large floods in northern Colorado, they were not wildfire related exclusively. Wildfires had impacts on some of the area that flooded, but it was just a freak, very large storm after several days. The areas within the state up in north that already had a watershed coalition, they were out of the gate doing work quickly. They had much more effective treatment, much faster. By building those groups, though, in areas that didn't have it, now we have those groups and they're stronger. And the next event in those areas, those groups are already working together. They're known, they know each other, they know the agency people, so they're much more effective. Debris flows not predicted to flood. It's hard. There are sometimes debris flows that happen in an area that agencies modeled and didn't show. But sometimes it is truly a fluke storm event. Now, most of the flooding and debris flows, we model it for 2-year and 10-year kind of events. That's basically what USGS is using in the landslide modeling. But if you get a 50-year rain event in that same basin, it's going to be a debris flow, even though their model didn't show it as a debris flow. It's just because it's so much more intensive of a flood, so much more intensive of a rain event. And I will say, out of anecdotal experience, fire scars, especially in the first couple of years, create their own flooding, their own rain events. This is anecdotal, there's no proof of it, but I will tell you that first couple of years after a fire, they all have higher intensity rain on them than surrounding areas. And it makes sense. The surrounding areas are still green and cooler, and that fire scar is black and bare dirt and hotter air. And so it just dumps more intensity until it becomes green. There is an effort to secure conservation fund through the legislative session, which will make state money available for non-federal matches. I'm not sure which state that is. And looking at making a trust fund for long-term. So whoever added that, if you can add what state you're talking about, that's an interesting thing. And again, I think more states are trying to be more proactive that way. Does New Mexico? We don't have matching funds. New Mexico does not. And that's a tough nut to crack. So at that point in time, if I lived in New Mexico, I would be working the state legislature to come up with a funding mechanism through some state agency to help with longer term solutions. And it does say they're working on getting behind proposed legislation, taking state legislators out to fire scars and talking them through it, doing a tour. And nonprofits can do that, and it's not necessarily considered lobbying, okay? You have cash limits on how much money you can spend, but if you're educating legislators through a tour, that does not count as lobbying, even if you're asking them to support a bill. So all the power to you on getting that moved forward. Federal NRCS funding on federal land since 2016. It has been used on the Cameron Peak fire in northern Colorado since 2016. Before that, we were able to use it on the Waldo fire in Colorado. I believe it's been used on the Grizzly Peak fire in Colorado. Other states, I'm not so sure of. If folks from NRCS or others want to pop in some comments on other states where it's been used, please do so. Funding through corporate entities typically go through nonprofit partners, though some of them will fund local governments or tribes. So that's kind of checking with their philanthropy department. If they have a local presence, they are more likely to fund. So if you have FedEx locally, you're more likely to get funded than if you don't have a distribution center locally, but it's still worth going through a corporation like that because they have an interest in keeping highways open. So there's a bit of homework to that. We've had luck with Pepsi and Coca-Cola on different funding sources because they both have, in their corporate sustainability missions, watershed health, water quality is something they are supporting and promoting. So looking at those kinds of corporate websites and saying, how do we link in to what they are interested in? thank you. Somebody totally agrees with fire scars creating their own weather. If you spend time on them, you come to that decision. Someday we need to get a scientific study to confirm that. Because like I say, it's what we all see, but we haven't had it studied. And again, with that funding from corporations, I would say the good thing about it is if they agree to fund, they put money, they give you the money up front. They don't wait until after. NRCS can and does provide technical assistance, and that's important. So a lot of times they are going to help get some of the tech assist and the analysis done for recreation values and things like that that impact the communities at large. So again, that's where if we have recovery committees put together, if we get all the folks at the table working with each other, talking together, we find ways to thread the needle on some things, but it's still not going to be easy until we get we actually, to do this just sort of carte blanche, we need changes to federal laws and regulations. So yeah, as I said, with it being talked about at the Washington level, I have faith that something will happen, but it takes a lot of time to make it happen. Oh, a fun article on fires creating their own weather. Conservation.com, wildfire scars. I got to go check that out. Because that is something that I've seen quite literally for 20 plus years now. And when I first used to say it, people would tell me I was batshit nuts, excuse my language. But as more people have worked more fire scars, people are going, oh yeah, that's what happens. What's this next one at the bottom? On the screen about integrating federal, state, and local funding. Absolutely. So one of the things that you need to figure out is how do you leverage all these different funds against each other? And that's where it's great if you do have some, very willing local government partners, some very willing nonprofit partners who can work together. We can bring a little bit from this pot, a little bit from that pot, a little bit of private funding, somebody who's tracking the volunteers for the in-kind, and we can blend these pots of money. And like I said, this is how we get to long-term recovery money. It's not all going to ever come out of one pocket, out of one group's pocket, because that's just not how the agencies work. But if we have bits from here and bits from there and bits from another place, all of a sudden we can keep money flowing and keep longer term projects going. With NRCS's EWP program, I will say that, there's a matching requirement that and NRCS people can pop in here and add this for me. There's I think it's a 25% match for the technical assist part. That's getting the engineers and folks that can help you develop that plan to do work. And then there's a 40% or 50% match on the actual project cost, or it can be a lower match if you're in a community that has a lot of low income folks that you're dealing with. So connecting with your local NRCS people, they're going to help you figure out what you can do for match. And most of the time I found the agency people want to help all of us within the rules they have to work under to figure out how to do more work. So, having them involved, befriending them and saying, how do we make this happen? They will help us figure out a path forward. But you kind of got to build those relationships ahead of time if you can. So again, if you haven't already had the big fire, start having those communications, start talking to folks. If you have had a big fire, as soon as it's happening, set up your local recovery committee and get everybody you can get at the table. People like your county emergency managers, they're going to focus more on, the cleanup, the life-threatening pieces. In the immediate moment, they're gonna focus on specific homes that are at risk, specific notification protocols. But that recovery committee working together is still going to be able to build a long-term program. Typically, infrastructure is designed for a 100-year event. Why aren't agencies working in fire scars designing for these extreme events? I'm going to tell you they're starting to in fire-prone areas. That's part of in the state of Colorado. We are just completing through CWCB. I see Andrea is on from CWCB. We're creating a wildfire ready watersheds program. And that's really looking at these questions. And then it's thinking about when we do rebuild, do we get larger? How do we rebuild in areas for post-fire that have not burned yet? And so that is something that's happening in a lot of places. And that's where at a very local level, like I said, even before a fire, if you know you've got a fire-prone mountain above you, using stream stats and running through that on fairly small watersheds, so going into smaller sub-watersheds and looking at them, you can start to think about that. And then if the county is going to be rebuilding a culvert anyway, then rebuilding it for a larger event in the first place makes sense. And a lot of times it doesn't cost that much to upgrade when you're doing an initial project anyway. Somebody is working on better post-fire response between the agencies, and we should talk offline. Absolutely. You have my contact. Please reach out. I'm assuming you're a FEMA person, but whoever you are, let's talk. Because I think the more we can get this nailed down, the better off we're going to be. NRCS through EWP program has an exigency pot of money usually, and that's going to help with those really short-term things, the really quick turnaround like sandbags, concrete barriers, things like that. The one thing I'll say about concrete barriers, figuring out where to use them is something you got to think about, because a lot of times concrete floats. People do not realize that. So things like coffin blocks, we call them the big concrete blocks, or Jersey barricades can be helpful, but there's a lot of areas also where I've seen them put in, and I would strongly recommend using them in that situation. That will also bring a point that the more experienced the engineers and the agency people you have working on a fire that have already been there and done it, the more likely they're going to go, oh yeah, this is not a place where we should use HESCO cages or concrete barriers. This is a place where we should actually use different structures. But we sandbag wells, we sandbag houses, because that again can be done really quickly. I've seen a lot of counties have purchased in Colorado like a sandbag filling machine, and they'll go out and do sandbag filling days around the community so community members can come get filled sandbags. Any other questions or comments? Because we are now at 10:07 and I don't want to keep people way longer than we said we would. So you all have my contact. Please feel free to reach out. If people have suggestions for specific future After the Flames webinars, we'd love to hear your suggestions. If you have suggested speakers other than me, if you want to narrow a topic and get a series of speakers like on the funding question, we can do that over the next year. You can reach out to Esther for those suggestions. And thanks very much, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Guys.
Thank you, Carol. And thank you to all the participants for such an active dialogue. That was wonderful. And, as was mentioned several times during this webinar, reach out to Carol, myself, others at the COCO team, at the Quivera team, CJ, and we are happy to help connect you guys with resources we talked about today, answer follow-up, discuss, questions, and think, work together on how to provide the resources that are best going to support all of you. So, let's keep the dialogue going. And thanks to Quivira and CJ for such a wonderful partnership on this program today.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. And I just want to second that and say really specifically, we'd like to know what you think about it. Everybody here, you participants, big picture you, about how you'd like to follow up on these conversations and how we can support communities in moving these conversations forward so that you feel more prepared and feel like you have access to the resources that you need. So I will actively be doing that, and please feel free to reach out with anything that you want to talk about specifically. Yay. Thank you, everyone. And also I keep sending the evaluation form. That is a great place to put that.
CJ, you've got that down in the links, but will you send out an email to everybody with that evaluation
Yes,
form?
absolutely.
That'll be
Yeah,
good.
more emails from me. Don't worry.
Great. Thank you, folks. It was nice talking to everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Carol. Happy Friday, everyone.